Welcome to the deep dive. When you requested this whole ADD and autism connection thing, I was really interested. It's something I honestly still get tripped up by sometimes.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, even for, those of us working with this stuff all the time.
And cheap ABA really got me thinking because I thought I had a decent grasp on ADD and autism, but the way they connect the two is kind of mind-blowing.
Absolutely. I think even just defining ADD and autism can be confusing. ADD or ADHD as it's officially known now, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
hmm
People simplify it to just focus problems.
Yeah, I get that. I'll admit, when I hear ADD, I think of like someone who can't find their keys or starts a million projects at once.
Yeah. And while those can be signs, it's so much deeper than that. And with autism, it's even broader. Because now you're talking about how someone communicates, how they interact, even how they process their senses. The range is huge.
That's where the whole spectrum thing comes in, right? Like, two people with autism can have totally different experiences.
Exactly. And that's what I found so interesting about cheap ABA. They highlight how much overlap there actually is between ADD and autism,
Hmm.
which is surprising even for experts.
Right. I always thought of them as separate things, but it's more like, remember those Venn diagrams from school? Lots of crossover.
Exactly. Take like social situations, both ADD and autism can make those tough,
Yeah.
but for totally different reasons.
Totally. And those subtle differences, that's where things get super interesting. Like someone with ADD might blurt something out, not because they're trying to be rude, but their brain's already moved on to the next thing.
Whereas someone with autism might be struggling to read those unspoken social cues, like body language or sarcasm. It's like they missed getting that instruction manual everyone else seems to have.
So both might seem awkward or uncomfortable socially, but for completely different reasons. And that's just one example. Cheap ABA also brought up this interesting thing about focus, which seems counterintuitive at first.
You'd think ADD is all about not focusing, and autism is those super intense interests.
Right, which can be true, but Cheap ABA points out that both groups can struggle with attention, just in opposite ways.
Yeah. Someone with ADD might be bouncing between tasks, leaving things unfinished, and then someone with autism could be hyper-focused on one specific thing to the exclusion of, well, everything else.
That's not just having focus, it's being able to control it. That's a big takeaway for me.
Totally. And then there are those shared struggles that cheap ABA gets into, like with sensory input and emotional regulation.
Right, both ADD and autism often come with that increased sensitivity to things like bright lights, loud sounds, certain textures, which can make everyday life feel overwhelming.
And it's so easy for those who don't experience it to misinterpret. Imagine like a tag on your shirt, but it's so irritating, so distracting, can't focus on anything else.
And then on top of that, the emotional side, it can be intense.
Exactly. Big feelings, maybe
Yep.
quick to anger, or having what look like outbursts to other people. It's not about being difficult. It's about the brain trying to process a world that can feel like too much.
So with all this overlap, it makes you wonder, how are ADD and autism even considered separate things?
That's where I think cheap ABA does a good job of bringing some clarity.
Yeah.
By going back to those core symptoms, like ADD or ADHD, it really comes down to attention regulation, those struggles with focus, organization, impulse control, stuff like that.
Right, like the brain is having trouble hitting the brakes and steering the car at the same time.
Exactly. Perfect analogy. Autism, though, that centers on those differences in social communication and what they call restricted repetitive behaviors.
Okay, so we're talking about those social interactions being tricky, maybe some repetitive movements, needing things a certain way.
Yeah. And cheap ABA actually made a point that I thought was really interesting. Even the types of repetitive behaviors can be different, depending on if it's just autism or both.
Oh, tell me more about that.
So like with just autism, those repetitive actions, they might be more physical, like lining things up, flapping hands, things that kind of bring order to their world. But when you add in ADD,
It becomes more like mental repetition.
yeah, exactly. Think like racing thoughts, maybe getting stuck on a worry, replaying conversations over and over. It's like the repetition goes internal. Cheap ABA even suggests that that might be part of why co-occurrence is often missed.
Because it's not as obvious as someone, say, rocking back and forth. That makes a lot of sense.
Right. And it really highlights why this whole deep dive is so important. If we're misunderstanding the behaviors, we're also going to misunderstand how to support them. Now, to kind of go back to those social differences for a second, cheap ADA talks about how those manifest uniquely too.
Right, like we talked about how ADD might mean someone's interrupting, not to be rude, but because their brain's moving so fast.
Exactly. They might dominate the conversation without even realizing other people haven't had a turn to talk.
Yeah.
But with autism, it's not so much about impulsivity. It's more they're missing those subtle cues.
Like taking things literally, not getting sarcasm or humor that relies on those double meanings.
Right, exactly. Or maybe they're avoiding eye contact, but not because they're not interested, but because it just feels overwhelming. And those social pieces, those are huge in really understanding the distinction between these two.
And then you've got how their interests play out, too. You mentioned autistic individuals often having those deep, specific passions.
Right, right. It's like they're fascinated by something, trains, maps, history, and they absorb everything about it. But what cheap ABA suggests is that with that co-occurring ADD, those interests,
They become less laser-focused and more, I don't know, like a sparkler. All those bright sparks, but they burn out quickly.
that's a great way to put it. It's like they might try a ton of hobbies, but that real deep dive, that mastery, it's harder to find.
Okay, so we've got all this overlap, these really key differences, and then that co-occurrence thing, that statistic from Cheap ABA, just blew me away. 30 to 50% of autistic people might also be dealing with ADD symptoms.
It's huge and honestly so often missed. And it's not just some interesting fact. This has real implications for how we diagnose and support people.
So it's not enough to just check one box. You need someone who can really look at the whole picture.
Yeah. I mean, think of it this way. If you're only looking for a hammer, you're never going to see the screwdriver right next to it. Comprehensive assessment, that's how you figure out what tools someone actually needs.
Because if you get the diagnosis wrong or you miss part of it, you're not really giving them what they need to succeed.
Right. Like imagine giving someone running shoes when they're training for a swim meet. We might make some progress, but they're not set up to do their best.
Totally. And that's what Cheap ABA kept coming back to, right? That it's all about making sure the support actually fits the individual.
Absolutely. I mean, take that example we were talking about, the kid who's hyper-focused but also impulsive because of the ADD. A common thing people might try is to give them a less stimulating environment so they can focus better.
But if they've got those sensory sensitivities too, that could make things worse. It's about finding the right kind of stimulation, not just less of it.
Exactly. It just shows how easy it is to make assumptions. Each person is different, and really understanding the nuances, that's how we figure out what actually helps.
So how do we bring this all together for our listeners out there? Can you give us a real-life example of how this co-occurrence thing might actually look?
Sure. Let's say you've got a teenager. We'll call him Alex. He's amazing with computers, taught himself how to code, spends hours building websites. That deep dive into tech could definitely be a sign of that special interest we see in autism.
Okay, yeah, tracking so far.
But then you notice Alex also has a really tough time getting ready for school in the morning, loses track of time constantly, gets distracted by anything interesting he sees. His room's a mess.
Sounds like those classic ADD struggles, that executive function piece.
Exactly. And then at school, he's getting A's in his computer science classes, but group projects? Forget it. He misses social cues, takes jokes literally, would much rather work alone.
So he's excelling in some areas, but hitting a wall in others. And, if you just looked at his grades, you might miss that whole other side of it.
And that's exactly why recognizing this co-occurrence is so important. Because it's not like Alex is choosing to be disorganized or to have trouble socially. His brain just works differently.
Yeah.
And those challenges are just as real as his talent with computers.
It makes you realize how important awareness is. And not just for doctors and therapists, but for parents, teachers, friends, anyone who's interacting with someone who might be dealing with both of these things.
100%.
Yeah.
And the great thing is, Cheap ABA actually gives some really solid advice on this, like breaking tasks down into smaller chunks to help with that executive function piece, or using visuals and timers so transitions are easier.
Those little things can make a huge difference. And again, it's not about trying to fix anyone. It's about giving them the tools to manage in a world that wasn't really built for them.
Yeah, well said. I mean, at the end of the day, knowledge is power, right? The more we understand about ADD, about autism, how they can go together, the better we can support people.
Yeah.
And celebrate that neurodiversity, honestly.
I feel like this deep dive has been a huge eye-opener. We've talked about the overlap, those key differences, that whole co-occurrence piece. But I think the biggest thing I'm taking away is
What is it?
don't jump to conclusions. Every person is unique, and what looks like one thing on the surface might be something totally different underneath. Ask questions, be open-minded, and remember different doesn't mean less than. It just means we need to look a little closer.
I love that. Couldn't have said it better myself. So to everyone listening, keep learning, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep your mind open to how incredible people are in all their different ways. Until next time, happy diving.